everyone. It's great to be here on this rather dark, grey, wet evening. What a joy to come together and worship Jesus. As Tom and Georgia said, we're continuing our series tonight looking at the book of James. And over the last few weeks, we may have noticed that James is a rather challenging, hard-hitting book. It's short, but impactful. Well, tonight is no different, as we are looking at how we can be a community of peacemakers as we look at this passage about taming the tongue, which I'm going to read for us now. It's James chapter 3, verses 1 to 18. So if you'd like to follow along with me, that would be great. James chapter 3, verses 1 to 18. Not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways, and if anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouth of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they're so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Ouch. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and creatures of the sea are being tamed and have been tamed by man, but no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. Can fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? Can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. This is the word of the Lord. I feel like we need to remind ourselves this is the word of the Lord, that there is stuff in here for us tonight that is going to bring life to us and transform us, even in the challenge that it presents. Now, I always have mixed feelings as I embark on talk writing. On the one hand, I feel super excited and privileged that I get to be part of proclaiming the word of God to people. But on the other hand, I can feel pretty terrified. When I get a passage to preach on and I begin the process of talk writing, I get the blank screen fear. That feeling that Sunday is coming and I'm going to be standing up in front of a church of people with nothing to say. thankfully, it hasn't ever happened yet, and all so far is looking good for tonight. But I can really remember one of my first evening preaches at a church in Chorleywood in Hertfordshire. It was the 26th of February, 2012, and I'd been asked by the vicar to speak at the start of January. I couldn't think of much between when I was asked to speak in January and the end of February. And the morning of the preach, on the 26th of February, I woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I knew that it would be about 12 and a half hours before I would be speaking that evening, and I spent the day terrified. The weight of responsibility of proclaiming God's word to God's people. And it has got better over the years. But I still do get nervous because of what it is that we're doing as we read God's word. So you can probably imagine how I felt when I realized that this passage here in James chapter 3 was mine to speak on tonight. Not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. Help. Already feeling nervous, now terrified. You know, when you're in a position of leadership, whether that's in the church or beyond, and teaching others, the words that you say have a wider influence, which is why James begins by chucking out this warning to teachers and to leaders. But what James is saying in this passage isn't just for those people, for those of us who find ourselves in front of a crowd and in positions of leadership. Because in verse 2, he draws everybody in. We all stumble, he says. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, a perfect woman. And I just want to stop there for a second. Did you notice, as this passage was read just now, what James is saying? This is huge. That if we can say nothing wrong, then we are perfect. So the key to a perfect life is to gain control of our tongues, and as the smallest part of our body, surely it cannot be that hard. But I think every single one of us knows that that is not the case. If you pause for a moment and think about the week that has passed, which of us can say in the last 7 days we've never lied, complained, moaned, been sarcastic, which literally means flesh tearing? It can be easy just to say, oh, just a little sarcasm, sarcastic sense of humor. But actually that can be, when used in the wrong way, quite damaging. Which of us hasn't boasted or exaggerated or condemned? I'm going to stop there because I don't think I can think about any more of those things. But we suddenly realize that we are far from perfect. And something that seems so simple is in fact a lot harder than it looks. Now, I wonder if anyone, this is slightly changing the tone, but hopefully on the same point, which of us has successfully mastered the Rubik's Cube? I wonder if we can have a show of hands. Has anybody in this room successfully mastered the Rubik's Cube, Georgia? Oh, there's a few hands up. Fantastic. Well, I have never been able to do it. It's seemingly so simple. You just got to get all of the same color on each side of the cube. But I've never mastered it, but here's somebody that has. Let's have a look. Oh! Simple as that. Why did only a couple of hands go up? I don't know. But you know, this thing is so small and yet so challenging. So why is it that James is wanting us to get hold, to get hold of this stuff, to tame our tongues, to get control over this smallest part of our body? Well, the reason is because our words have power. Our words have power. The way we hear words and the way we say words shape our understanding. They shape our lives and they shape our view of the world. I can really remember as a child, we grew up in a kind of village church, and I'm one of 4 siblings, and we used to go in on a Sunday morning, and we'd all be sitting in the pew. And it was when my sister was about 12 years old. All of us can remember, and we regularly remind her of a time at the end of the reading, just like I did tonight, and the reader said, "This is the word of the Lord." Everybody responded with "Thanks be to God." And we heard my sister she thought in hushed tones, but it was louder than she thought, say to our mum, "Mum, why is God called Peter?" And Mum said, "He's not called Peter." Shh. No, Mummy, why is God called Peter? "No, kids, he's not called Peter." Shh. And all of us were just giggling away. And it turns out that for 12 years, she thought that when we say thanks be to God, we were actually saying thanks Peter God. And she believed that God was in fact called Peter. You know, it's just a silly little illustration, but it shows that words and the way we hear and understand them have power. They shape the way we see the world around us, and not in that example, but in others, can shape the course of our lives. And this is what James is saying. Our tongues may be small, but they have great power. And he uses these 3 illustrations of a bit in the mouth of a horse, a rudder on a ship, or a fire which is caused by a tiny little spark. Words can seem like those things, like the bit, the rudder, and the spark, so small and so insignificant, but they have enormous power. In Proverbs 18, we read that the tongue has power of life and death. And through the way we use our tongue, we can direct people towards life, or we can direct them towards death. And you know, the society that we live in today presents even greater challenges than anything James could have imagined when he wrote this letter. Because the impact of our words through email, social media, and the kind of technology we have at our fingertips now makes words travel far wider and have a far greater influence than anything James could have imagined as he penned this letter. Words have power for good and power for evil. And we're going to start by looking at the latter. Words can have power for evil. Though in Genesis 1, we read how God created by speaking, that he spoke and it came to be. In Genesis chapter 3, just a couple of chapters later, the devil's words brought destruction and devastation. And in verse 6 of this passage that we're looking at tonight, he makes it clear that the source of the tongue's evil is the devil, by pointing out that it is a fire set on fire by hell, and that therefore has immense power to destroy. I'm sure many of us are familiar with scenes of wildfires spreading uncontrollably and bringing about devastation and destruction. And in the same way, James is saying, if uncontrolled, our words can have devastating consequences. And I'm sure that many of us will have experienced that through either being on the receiving end of such words or speaking out hurtful words. And probably we've been in both camps at some point or another. Whether it's a careless word or an email sent in anger, a social media post just thrown out without much thought in the heat of the moment, all has power to destroy. And you know, there are definitely times I can think in my life when I have responded quickly, when I've said something that I wish that I could take back. But it's hard to do that once words have been spoken. And often the saddest thing is that they can be to the people that we love the most. In verse 8, James writes that the tongue is a deadly evil, full of deadly poison. And when I read this verse, I was reminded of a time a few years ago when my friend and I went on a 3-4 month trip to Australia and New Zealand. And we arrived in Sydney And we were exhausted after the flight from London. And we got picked up by the family we were staying with. We got driven back to the house we were going to be in for the next few days. And we were shown to our bedroom. We were told, this is our bathroom. Here are the towels that you can have and sleep well. It was nighttime, so it was perfect. We could just go straight to bed. And we did sleep really well until about 6, 7 in the morning. And we heard their little 6-year-old come running past the room where we were sleeping. "Mummy, Mummy," she screamed. "We found a funnel web in the girls' bathroom." Alice and I had been in Australia less than 12 hours. We had no idea what a funnel web was, but it didn't sound great. So we decided to get out of bed and investigate what was going on. And it turns out that there was these 2 little funnel web spiders in our bathroom. They were so tiny, but they are deadly. They are really bad. And you don't really want to be having a shower with one, which is probably what we'd, unbeknown to us, done the night before. But you know, these tiny little things, we had no idea, but they had great power. And this is what James says the tongue is like: full of deadly poison, so tiny, yet has the power to bring death. I'm sure many of us will be familiar with the saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And in 2015, I broke my arm, got a couple of places falling off my bike. Since then, those bones have healed and repaired really well. But I can still think of words that have been spoken over me in my life, which have continued to take hold and have an impact, and which haven't healed so quickly. The words that we say affect others. And maybe tonight, you are carrying words around with you that have been spoken over you, perhaps even decades ago. Words spoken to us can cause major devastation and ring in our ears for a very long time. Maybe words like, "We never wanted you," "You won't amount to anything, no one will choose you," "You can't do it," "You're stupid," "You're quiet," "You're loud," "You're unattractive," "You're weak." These lies that can just permeate and fill our minds like tapes, eating us up and destroying us. And no matter how many words of encouragement and affirmation we hear, they continue to hold power. Well, tonight we have an opportunity to bring these tapes before a God who loves us. A God who wants to heal and who has the power to do so, because yes, words have power. Yes, they have power to destroy and to lead us to death. But tonight we've come to worship a God who is even more powerful. A God who is able to take those destructive things that have been spoken over us and breathe life in place of death. He loves to wipe those tapes of destruction and replace them with truths that we are children of the Most High, that we are deeply loved, that we have been chosen, that we are accepted. So tonight we can ask him to do that, and we'll do that in a little while, to wounds that are still raw. But the reality is, if we are hurt by words that have been spoken to us, we'd be kidding ourselves if we failed to recognize that we hadn't had the same impact at times on other people. So I wonder what areas we need to be aware of tonight. Maybe it's gossip. Perhaps that can be disguised in all kinds of ways, but it can be a real challenge. Maybe it's lying or exaggerating or saying things to make ourselves look good. Maybe it's just this general discouragement that we just speak over people, or constant criticism. The words we say affect others. James also points out another relationship that's affected by our words, and which Tom alluded to earlier, that it affects not only our relationship with others, but our relationship with God. In verses 9 and 10, James talks about how we can be so hypocritical with our tongues. We come along on a Sunday, we worship God, we have a great time, but how quickly we can just say something to criticize another person, complaining about something that they've done or said. And when we do that, we're not just hurting them, but hurting God himself, because they're his children that we're talking about. They are his beloved children. They affect our relationship with others. They affect our relationship with God, and they affect our relationship with ourselves. James writes in verse 6 that words spoken wrongly corrupt the whole person. And the word he uses for corrupting literally means staining. These words that we can speak that cause damage to others end up staining us and impacting us. The point is this: if we're using our words for evil to impact other people, it will begin to impact us and set our lives on fire, as James describes in this passage. And you know, we read all this and it just feels so hopeless and depressing. And it's like, well, where do we even begin? Ellie, please stop talking. Maybe I should spend the rest of my life in silence. That's one thought that came to my mind as I was writing this. And then I realized I wouldn't last more than about 2 seconds. And for those who know me, they will know that that is true. But you know, it is not as hopeless as it looks. There is good news. And the good news is coming now, because our speech and our tongues are not inherently evil. Right at the very beginning of the story, as we've said, God spoke life into being. He spoke this world and us into being, and it was good. Our words have power for evil, but they also have great power for good. We can bring healing and life through the words we speak. And so many times, Solomon speaks of the positive power of words in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 10, the lips of the righteous nourish many. Proverbs 16, gracious words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. Our words can and do bring life. And I'm sure that we can remember times in our lives when words that have been spoken to us have just made our hearts sing. Times when a word or an affirmation has come just at that opportune moment and it has boosted us. I, for years, have carried around with me a bag of, well, multiple bags now of cards and encouragements that people have written, whether that's friends or family or youth or students from different ministries that I've had the privilege of being part of. And when we were moving recently, my husband said, this is ridiculous. We are carrying so many bags of these cards. But for me, they're just so precious. So I put them all into a scrapbook. So now we're carrying loads of scrapbooks around with us. But, you know, it's so good to be able to hold on to those things. And they have a real impact on us. One of the mums from the youth group that I used to lead told me that after a youth weekend away where we wrote encouragement cards to all the children, well, they wrote them to each other, she went to change her daughter's bed and she found the encouragement card under her pillow. She'd been sleeping with it at night because it was just such an encouragement to her. And the mum was just like, thank you for doing that, because that's clearly had an impact on her. So I wonder who needs to hear words of encouragement from us this week, over the next 7 days. Maybe it's a friend or a neighbor or a colleague. Maybe it's someone in our church family. Take a moment to ask God to show you who you can pick up the phone to, who you can write a letter to, maybe pay someone a visit. Wouldn't it be great if what people said about us as the family of St. Michael's was that we were a community of peacemakers who used our tongues to build each other up, not to tear each other down? And in our culture, in our world, that will make a difference. People will notice something different about us. And, you know, even if it seems like they don't, we can be sure that there is one who always hears and always sees and always knows and who loves it when we encourage and build up his children. And that is Almighty God, the author of life itself. So how do we do it? How can we begin to control our tongues? Well, in verse 8, James does drop a bit of a bombshell as he writes that no man can tame the tongue. Well, great. Thanks, James. Another encouragement in this passage, or not. He's made aware of this big problem in our lives and then said that, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And again, that can leave us feeling a bit hopeless, but there is hope. If we look at verses 11 and 12, can fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers, he writes, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. The state of the spring affects the water that flows from it. And the spring is our heart. The spring is our heart. The problem of the tongue is really a problem of the heart. And the key to taming our tongues is found in our hearts. That's where we've got to focus our attention tonight, because the state of our hearts will affect what comes out of our mouths. And so tonight I want to ask us the question, what is going on in our hearts that our mouths are pointing to? What is going on in our hearts that our mouths are pointing to? In Psalm 139, David shows us a great prayer that we can pray. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. It's a big prayer to pray, but it is the beginning of transformation. As we invite God in, he doesn't just search our hearts, point out what's wrong, and then leave us to get on with it. He comes alongside us by his Spirit, and he brings change and transformation. It's what he is in the business of doing. He is able to take our hearts of stone, our hearts that would lead us to speak words of destruction, and transform them into hearts of flesh that bring life. And really, only God can tame the tongue, because only God can change our hearts. And he goes on in verses 13 to 18 to talk about these two types of wisdom, earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. And if we are going to be a community of people who use our tongues for good and not for evil, a community of peacemakers, we need wisdom from heaven. Earthly wisdom with its envy and selfish ambition will lead to destruction. But heavenly wisdom is pure, peace-loving, considerate. We read that list, and it leads us to life. So if we want to be a community of peacemakers, we need to connect our hearts with heaven and allow God, the one whose words created and brought forth life, to transform our words so that what flows out of us is life-giving. Can't just talk about this stuff. We've got to do something about it. It's what James is talking about throughout this letter. And so I just want to finish by throwing out 3 things that maybe we want to be able to think about doing this week. Maybe we want to take some time, firstly, to think about those areas that we know we struggle with when it comes to taming the tongue. Those things we know are an issue for us. Maybe we don't know what they are. Well, we can ask that God would reveal by praying that prayer David prayed, that as God searches our hearts, he would highlight those things where our tongues are bringing death instead of life. Maybe if you're able to sit down with a trusted friend, somebody who knows you really well, ask them the question. It might be challenging, but it's worth it. Maybe there are people, secondly, that you want to apologize to for the words that you have spoken, for things that you've said that you know have hurt. Or maybe thirdly and finally, you have tapes playing round and round your head, full of words that have hurt you and torn you down. Well then, this week, bring them to God. Don't battle through them anymore, trying to sort it out yourself. Let him speak words of truth in place of those lies. James is right when he says that no man can tame the tongue, but God can, and he will if we let him, if we give him our hearts. And so tonight, God invites every single one of us to come to him, to ask him to set our hearts ablaze with his Spirit, to ask him to transform our lives so that we wouldn't be overtaken with fire from hell, which James talks about here, but with fire from heaven, which brings life to the world. When we're blazing with his fire in our hearts, our tongues will be tamed. People will notice something different, and we will become a community of peacemakers, which will make a difference in the world. Just before Tom comes to lead us in communion, we're going to have a chance just to pray, and we've got Sam and the band are going to lead us in a song of worship, Consuming Fire. We've talked about how we cannot do this on our own, that we need God's fire, God's Spirit, wisdom from heaven to clothe us with power from on high. And we have a chance to sing that and to pray that through this song. But can I invite you to stand where you are? We're gonna have a chance to pray in a little bit for one another. But right now, let's just take this moment as we are led in this song of worship together.